So again, welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us. It's great to see so many of you join us this evening. There's lots of familiar names I can see in the waiting in the participants, and plenty of new faces too, which is also great to see. Tonight's talk is to mark Women's History Month, and our speaker is Dr Leanne McCormick, who is a senior lecturer in modern Irish social history and also the director of the Centre for the History of Medicine in Ireland at Ulster University. Before I pass over to Dr. McCormick, I just want to make you all aware this is being recorded, as well as going out live on our Facebook. So out of courtesy, can I just ask you all to keep your mics muted for the duration of the talk? If you've got a question, there'll be an opportunity at the end for Dr. McCormick to field questions, but you can unmute yourself and ask in person. But you can also just pop it in the chat function at the bottom of Zoom, and then we can come back to it at the end. Either I can read it out for you, or you can raise your hand and ask it yourself. So without any further ado, over to you, Leanne.
Thank you very much, Al, for that introduction. And I'm just moving. I'm just going to apologise initially because I have a free-range dog and free-range children, so they are very good at bursting in at an opportune moment. So I'm hoping that everybody stays where they're supposed to be tonight. And also to say that it's great to be talking about this topic again. It's one that I worked on quite a few years ago, so it's been nice to return to it again. In the interim, I've been working on sort of a number of. The dog has just arrived, so there we are. Hopefully, she's just going to be quiet. She unfortunately, my door will open quite easily. So I have been working on was one of the co-editors of the report, Northern Ireland report into mother and baby homes and Magdalen laundries, and also another project that called Bad Bridget, which we do have, and I'm just going to shamelessly plug our podcast, which you might want to have a listen to. And we also have an exhibition opening in April, in Easter time, in the Ulster American Folk Park. So please keep an eye out for all those things too. So tonight, what I am going to be talking about are some of the interactions and relationships between American troops and women in Northern Ireland during World War II. And I'm going to start just with a bit of an overview, a little bit about the US troops coming to Northern Ireland. So this may or may not be very familiar to some of you, so apologies to those who are maybe going over ground that you've heard before. So US troops arrived in Northern Ireland in January 1942 following America's entry into the war. Prior to the troop arrival, there had been civilian workers who were there building bases. About 300,000 troops passed through Northern Ireland, with numbers peaking at around 120,000 in December of 1942. In December of 1943, representing at that time about a tenth of the population. So troops stationed all over Northern Ireland. The Air Force based in Langford Lodge on the shores of Lough Neagh, but with air bases all over Northern Ireland. This is the one at St Angelo and Lough Erne. The naval headquarters were in Derry. And there remained a US military presence there into the 1970s. And you can still see some of those traces on the landscape. This is a slide taken from Dr. Jim O'Neill's Twitter feed. And this one I thought was really interesting about at Killiman Castle in Cookstown. And I think they're planning to make a sort of museum out of some of the cellars of the castle, but you can see some of the graffiti and things that were left in the castle. So there are the remnants still around the landscape. And part of this Northern Ireland Defence Heritage Project as well, where they've got a really interesting map where you can kind of bring up where different things have been stationed. And I think they're still doing some work in identifying the areas, and of course excellent exhibitions as well about the US troops and their bases as well. And the troops, of course, did have a huge impact on the landscape and on the people. And I think sometimes when you look at the sort of sheer scale of many of these images, that you do get the sense of how that impact that there was in the sheer numbers of troops there as well. And for many of the US troops coming to Northern Ireland, it may well have been the first time for them that they'd ever left their country, their state, their town or their city. And those in particular coming from big cities, there must have been a real culture shock. And you can see, I suppose, for both American troops and for Northern Irish civilians, really stark cultural and social differences. Troops from large American cities who are used to wide varieties of entertainments, the idea of dating, found the situation in Northern Ireland very different. The US military published a pocket guide to Northern Ireland, which is a great read, and you can access it. It's available to download online if you just Google it. From a number of sites have digitized it. And when it talked about nightlife, it said there is virtually no nightlife. Pubs close early, and the floor show and the juke joint are non-existent. And when it spoke about with reference to women, and you can see the little bit there, it said that it was an old world country where a woman's place is still to a considerable extent in the home. In the cities, to be sure, modern trends and the pressure of war itself have liberalised social attitudes, but in the rural sections, and it is quite possible that you will be billeted in areas that are rural beyond your expectations, the old ideas still exist. Now, US troops did generate considerable concern in most of the places where they were based during the Second World War, whether that was in other parts of the UK or elsewhere as well. But there were some things that were specific to Northern Ireland which did add a sort of an extra additional layer of concern. It was the only part of the UK with a border with a neutral country. Eamon de Valera, the Taoiseach, was vocal in his opposition to there being troops based on the island of Ireland. And with this border with a neutral state, Northern Ireland was considered to be more vulnerable to enemy infiltration, as the border was easy to cross, and US troops were banned from crossing the border. But of course, added to this was the issue that, and one of the things that concerned a lot of the US military authorities, was the fact that lots of US troops had Irish ancestry, often quite recent, first and second generations or immigrants themselves. And those relatives were living, obviously, all across the island of Ireland. The fact that many would have been Catholic, there was the fear that they would have nationalist sympathies, anti-British views, and that's added kind of an extra dimension, that there was a fear that they might be susceptible to IRA influences. So there's a political dimension to troops being in Northern Ireland which isn't present elsewhere. And also the population of Northern Ireland being relatively small and rural meant, as we said, that the arrival of this large number of troops is quite dramatic and immediate in the effect that it has. And those concerns as well, particularly within what was a conservative and a traditional society with high church attendance and strong religious adherence. So both the Protestant and Catholic churches exerting lots of influence on attitudes and behaviour, and sort of stricter standards, arguably stricter standards of behaviour than other parts of the UK as well. And one thing that's commonly sort of said when discussing US troops is the fact that they were described as being as something of a silver screen in a time, and this is the time particularly when cinema going was huge, particularly for women and young women. And here were men in uniforms that actually fitted, that matched, compared to British soldiers where their uniforms didn't often match or necessarily fit. They sounded like Hollywood movie stars. It didn't matter that they sort of came from a some little house in rural Alabama. They sounded, you know, like the movie stars on the silver screen. They had money and they were happy to spend it. And they generated considerable excitement. They were obvious on the streets. They were obvious in their presence, as were the women who were often with them. And there was particular concern about young girls on the streets and their interaction with troops. During the Second War, as in the First World War, there was an increase in women in employment. There were more women who were living independently, who were living away from home, who were visible on the streets in the evenings, and this generated a lot of concerns. In June 1943, the Reverend Neil, when delivering the Home Mission report to the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in Ireland, stated that the number of girls running through the streets of Belfast and Derry is staggering. And the Catholic Bishop of Derry at a confirmation service in Donegal the same year said, "I wish I could take some of the people in this service to see the conduct of their girls in Derry. It would be better, pardon me, for some of them to live in potatoes and salt." And he appealed for stricter parental control. He said, Irish parents have always regarded the purity of their daughters as a very important thing. And similarly, a magistrate explained, who was pronouncing a sentence on a woman in Derry who had been charged with indecent behaviour, having been found with a sailor behind an air raid shelter in 1944, explained that we Irish men are rather proud of the purity of our Irish women, just like the purity of our racehorses. So there we have it. That's what it's thinking about women in the same as racehorses. And in particular, being seen on the streets with troops was not something that a decent girl did. And a censored letter from Lisburn said, "You would hardly meet a decent girl anymore over here now. They are ruined by the Yanks. One is not safe going out with any of them. You know young CW? She has disgraced her mother. She's gone out with Yanks all day long, and I hear she's got that bad disease." And the magistrate at a trial in Derry for a woman charged with disorderly and indecent behaviour explained that the police had great difficulty when they saw women speaking to troops. And his advice was that any woman who has any respect for herself isn't to be seen strolling the streets of Derry at night. And there was a crackdown in Derry by police on women and girls who were believed to be taking part in immoral activities. And realistically, it seemed that even talking to troops in the street was enough to prompt arrest. The Londonderry Sentinel recorded 3 cases in March 1943, where girls were fined for obstruction, and they all claimed, so essentially obstructing the pavement, and they all claimed that they had been stopped by sailors and asked for directions. So often these were that you couldn't get past, you couldn't get past on the street, they were blocking the pavements, and this is what was prompting arrests. And the newspaper report discussed this problem in a report called Filthy Little Girls in February 1943. And it said these two girls had been found, charged with, again, one of the other charges that was used in this situation was wandering with any visible means of support. So they were found in the streets, they didn't have any money or proof of what they were doing or where they should be doing or anything to kind of how they were going to sort of support themselves. And they'd been seen by the police going into a boarding house with US Marines. And the head constable commented that there'd been a very big increase in that type of girl coming into the city in the hope of picking up servicemen and getting money from them. They got drunk and they caused malicious damage. They're very objectionable and degraded the city. And he concluded these filthy little girls are a pest. Similarly, a magistrate in Derry, after placing 2 15-year-old girls on probation and instructing them to keep outside the city at night, warned householders to be very careful employing maids, having regard to the present loose and disgraceful state of affairs amongst young women and girls in the city. I can just hear somebody's, if you wouldn't mind just muting your mic. I don't know whether everybody can hear or whether it's just coming through my computer, but there's just a wee bit of feedback coming through. So there are a whole range of these kind of arrests for a variety of offences, but the implication is that these sort of girls in particular are up to no good, and again, the loose and disgraceful conditions. There was some concern, though, that about this fact that women could be arrested and imprisoned on what appeared to be very little evidence. And the Church of Ireland chaplain at Armagh prison, where women prisoners were sent, was very concerned about this. And he gave an example of a girl who was imprisoned for 3 months for solicitation, who didn't even understand the meaning of the word. And he said he felt it was very easy to lift a girl seen speaking to a man on a charge of solicitation, where she might be engaged in an innocent conversation. Now, Detective Inspector Dobbin, speaking about girls who'd been fined for obstruction in Derry when they claimed they'd been stopped by sailors to ask for direction, he said that girls of this description gave a lot of trouble. And if they went home at a respectable hour, members of the service would not give as much trouble. And very often, again, this was the rhetoric that the behaviour of girls was the problem rather than men. And the actions of US troops in particular were often played down for political reasons. And when there were complaints, they were often explained away or refocused on the women involved. Women were accused of loose morals, of pursuing and throwing themselves at soldiers. In 1943, in a letter to the editor of the Belfast Telegraph, the author expressed disgust at having seen some, and I quote, nice-looking American soldiers being pursued by 2 very undesirable young women who were causing them great embarrassment by trying to talk to them and force their companionship on them. And it was felt that there was a bad element who leads them on. And while there, this was the American troops, conduct is disgraceful, a lot of our girls are 100% worse. Some had even further who said that they were, again, I'm quoting, all after the Yanks for a good time. It would make you feel ashamed of Northern Ireland. And behaviour and this sort of conduct that was often disgraceful from the Americans was seen as, and this is again how it was portrayed, and I'm quoting, a lot of kids only acting the fool and dirty girls hitchhiking them away and leaving them without a cent. Another writer this was from County Antrim, and this is some of the material coming from censored letters at the time. It said, I do not blame the girls. I do not blame the men, rather. The girls throw themselves at them because they have plenty of money and can give them a good time. And the fact was that these American troops often did have more money than British troops and civilians, and of course they were happy to spend it. And the RUC Inspector General reported in 1943 that locals, particularly the women, got on well with the troops as long as they lavished money on them. And this money was often used to buy alcohol. One censored letter declared that it will be a red letter day in Ireland when the Yankee army clears out. They're the worst set of drunkards that was ever imported into any place. And following the court case of a young woman charged with drunkenness and indecent behaviour, she'd been found in an air raid shelter in Derry with an American soldier. Now, the girl was drunk, but the soldier was sober. The resident magistrate asked the military and the police authorities to control the price of alcohol. He said it was common knowledge that the Americans with their big pay could buy bottles of whiskey at £3. And this ability to buy large amounts of alcohol and other goods did generate considerable anxiety and considerable jealousy, really, from local men and from British troops who weren't able to do the same. And of course, that old phrase about the American troops being over here, overpaid and oversexed and over here. And particularly then when it came to American attention, as to women's attention as well. So not only did they have all the money, but they were then getting all the women too. One fight in Derry was caused by 3 British soldiers challenging an American soldier sitting with some girls at a dance with the taunt, "These bloody Yanks get all the girls around here." And the fights and the concern about troop safety did lead to restrictions been placed on places to which US troops could go. So across Northern Ireland, there was lists, and the list kind of was updated regularly about places that were off limits to the Americans. And these included pubs and hotels and cafes, some residential properties. Some were placed off limits because they were located in areas known for IRA or Republican sympathies, as well as public houses that had been discovered selling alcohol at inflated prices, and excessive amounts to Americans were also put on the list. And then what were known as disorderly houses, which is the term, and disorderly behaviour when related to women often meant related to sex work, to solicitation. And disorderly houses were effectively brothels, or were women who were deemed to be unsuitable, were known to frequent, and they were often placed out of bounds too. In Belfast, Amelia Street, which was infamous as a red light area, was completely off limits. And in Derry, again, there were particular places that caused concern. The senior US Shore Patrol officer believed that there was a particular amusement centre on William Street, and as well as that was of particular concern, and also was next in line behind the Criterion Dance Hall as far as disorderly behaviour was concerned, which he saw as a favourite spot for prostitutes to work their pickup racket. And through the years of the Second World War, there was an increase in prosecutions for offences like solicitation, indecent behaviour, and brothel keeping. And newspapers reported on cases where police had been keeping surveillance on houses where they'd identified that large numbers of troops were entering and leaving. And usually associated with that, there was evidence of alcohol being consumed on the premises as well. In one case, a house in Derry saw 60 US and Canadian troops and civilians enter the house and then leave smelling strongly of alcohol over a 10-day period. In another trial of a husband and wife and 8 other women who were accused of assisting them in running a brothel in Portrush, the police sergeant reported that he'd noticed, as he described them, a debauched and tramp class of female going into the premises late at night, and American and Canadian soldiers and sailors leaving the premises in the late hours. And he also reported how he'd seen the Canadian Shore Patrol truck call and collect Canadian sailors and take them back to camp. So it suggests that there was sort of at some level an official condoning of this behaviour, that they knew what was happening and they went to pick them up and brought them back from this particular house. And they end up sort of raiding this house, knocking the door. And when they asked the tenant, William Simpson, what the sailors were doing, he had told them that they'd come in for a cup of cocoa and then they'd laid down just to have a rest for a while. But unsurprisingly, the court wasn't convinced about this explanation, and he was sentenced to 2 months hard labour. And particularly condemned by magistrates in court and by the press were those women who were associating with troops, who were mothers and were deemed to be neglecting their children when they were doing this. One newspaper headline was "Soldier's Wife Sentenced, Neglect of Children, Out to 2 a.m, Sailor Escort, Disgrace to Irish Womanhood." And the magistrate summing up this case said, "This is as shocking a case as I've ever heard in this court, in view of the fact that we pride ourselves on the high standard of Irish women. I hope there is no soldier or sailor or airman's wife in Derry or County Derry or anywhere in Ireland who has committed this horrible crime. It has dishonoured the name of Irish women." And other than policing the streets, physically, there were a number of other ways in which the interaction with troops and local women was also controlled and regulated. One of the most popular forms of entertainment for troops were dances, many of which were organised by the American Red Cross, which looked after soldiers off base in local towns. And they'd taken over, this is an image of them taken over in Belfast, the Plaza Hotel. But there was a lot of concern about the type of girls who were attending dances. And Louise Farrand, who was the assistant director of the Belfast American Red Cross Club, she explained that we have, and I'm quoting, we've attempted to have a date night twice a week, permitting the men to bring their own girls. The result was not particularly desirable, and we've decided to abandon that in favour of working up our own hostess list. And what they did was they contacted the personnel managers of large organisations and businesses and asked them to recommend groups of desirable girls. And then they would be interviewed, they would be checked by the authorities for security reasons, and if they were deemed suitable, they were given a permanent pass. So you could go in and out of the dances. And if a soldier wanted a particular girl on the list, she would have to be registered and complied with these regulations as well. Now, a month later, Miss Farrand explained that we are building our dance hostess list very slowly, as we feel we must be cautious in this matter. And she went on to say the city is teeming with undesirables. And while we are holding no brief for soldier morality, I think they might have been, we feel that we wish to maintain a certain high standard of atmosphere in order that the boys will feel we are trying to give them the thing they want most, the companionship of nice girls. And it's clear very much that within all of this discussion, there very much was a class element, that this was very much, lower working class women who were deemed as a threat to the troops, who were supposed to be deliberately trying to accost and seduce them, and who weren't the kind of better class of women that it was felt that soldiers should be meeting. And one of the major concerns relating to this seduction, and one that a lot of the authorities feared in particular, was the contraction of venereal disease, so syphilis and gonorrhea in particular, and the impact that this would have on troops. Now, this was common to other conflicts, and World War I, there'd been sort of similar legislation passed as well near the end of the war about trying to control and regulate venereal disease. And the British government was reluctant to introduce too harsh legislation because there had been quite a public outcry about legislation passed in World War I. But in November 1942, they did pass legislation which was supposed to be gender neutral, but did target women and sort of saw women as those who spread the disease rather than men. Now, the American military did produce a great deal of publicity and propaganda advising about the dangers of the disease. And very much, as you can see from these images, the focus was on women. The Guide to VD Control for Non-Commissioned Officers in 1941, published by the US Social Protection Division, sort of dispelled, it was an attempt to dispel lots of myths that they felt surrounded these diseases. And one of which was, it said it was honourable to conceal the identity of the contact, so the identity of the person you had got this disease from. And the reply to the myth was as follows: the girl has burnt you. She has not been concerned with your health. She is likewise causing other men with whom you are living and fighting for your country the same trouble she is causing you. You should try to protect your friends from a girl who is not interested in anything but money or the drinks she can get from you and your friends. And another pamphlet, so you've got a furlough coming up, published by the US War Department in 1944, again shows the sort of similar attitude. It basically blames all young women, and it, first of all, advised on sexual relationships outside marriage as the most important protection against venereal disease, but then it goes on to state: avoid prostitutes, pickups, pushovers, and easy women. Prostitutes, particularly without exception, are infected with venereal disease. They are not and cannot be made safe. Pickups and other easy women are by all odds likely to be infected too. Another thing to remember is that a girl free of infection at one time may now have had VD and pass it on to you. So all women were in effect potential sources of venereal disease. And the methods used, one of them, there was a particular comic book series as well called Dr. Carter BD Comics, who went round and treated venereal disease. One of the methods used to prevent venereal disease, which was issuing prophylaxis, so issuing condoms and setting up various stations for treatment immediately after you'd had any kind of sexual contact. And these prophylaxis were issued to troops from American Red Cross clubs, and that was met with substantial opposition in Northern Ireland. The US troops referred to the prejudice amongst the civil population that they felt prevented the usual establishment of a prophylactic station at US bases there. So instead of using the term prophylactic, there was a sign that said aid station in conjunction with a green light. Now, evidently, at least some US troops were making use of their prophylactics. As a report from Armagh described how troops were employed in this city with spiked sticks to walk around picking up the litter of condoms, particularly when US troops were leaving. One of the other additional factors that added and featured in relationships between troops and local women was that caused tension was the issue of race. And this is something, there's a new book out by Simon Topping about race more broadly and US troops in Northern Ireland during the Second World War. So if you're interested in hearing more on that, that's a great place to go. And the tension really, though, when it related to women, was often between white and black American soldiers rather than amongst from Northern Irish people. One American corporal based in Northern Ireland wrote home, "The people over here make absolutely no distinction between the races as we do in the States. And when the black and the oranges meet, well, I can't say what a coloured race it'll be. It's not uncommon to see a white woman and a black man walking down the street together." And for many Northern Irish people, these were the first black people that they had seen. And they were both captivated and had lots of questions. One black private wrote, "The Irish people treat us just as if we were Irish. Before we came here, there weren't any coloured people. And from that, you know, the kind of questions we were asked when we landed. The girls over here are right in there, if you dig what I mean." Two other black soldiers recorded how all the girls are going crazy for us, and get a load of this, I'm loaded down with these Irish girls. I have found my rose. Again, in a reference to the popular song at the time, Johnny Doughboy found his rose in Ireland. But for many of the white Americans, particularly those from southern United States, and of course this is a period before civil rights movement, the mixing of races in a social arena was simply abhorrent to them. And one letter sort of described how those from the South want to go out and carve up the coloured boys immediately. The Civil War has started amongst the American troops in Ireland. And there was a very real threat of physical violence, and numerous fights broke out between black and white soldiers in pubs and dance halls. And the American consul in Belfast, Parker W. Burham, in a letter to David Gray, the American ambassador in Dublin, explained how there had been some friction around Londonderry between our Negro Navy personnel and our troops, arising out of the fact that the troops objected to the American Negroes dancing with the Irish girls, which precipitated a good many fights in the local dance halls. And the result was often racially separate and segregated dance nights to try and solve this issue. But not all contacts between American men and Northern Irish women ended in legal or medical complications. And just weeks after the arrival of American troops in the British Isles, there came the first requests for marriages with local girls. And the first marriage in Northern Ireland involving an American serviceman took place just over 2 months after the first troops have arrived. And on the 13th of April, 1942, 20-year-old Private Herbert W. Cook from Cleveland, Ohio, married Thelma Smith, the daughter of a Belfast cafe owner at a local Presbyterian church. Now, the officiating minister felt that as long as the license was in order, he wasn't obliged to secure permission from the groom's commanding officer. Now, this is sort of, for me, a reminder about sometimes as historians we forget we're talking about real people with real histories and stories of their own. And I had written an article where I had mentioned Herbert Cook, and one day then I had an email from his granddaughter who subsequently sent me through lots of pictures of her grandparents, which I'm going to just show you now, and the scrapbooks that they had kept from the time about. I mean, their marriage was all over the papers, largely because it ended up. The concern that there wasn't permission, it ended up in a lot of secrecy because of it happening, and it ended up being they closed the doors of the church so that nobody could come in. And actually, Thelma's dad ended up not being able to get into the church all the time because the doors were shut at the time. But it is, this sort of love at first sight romance. And again, also in the American papers as well as the newspapers here, where he was partly a woman hater, but he didn't reckon on Irish eyes. And then they went on to have a little girl, and it's an image of him. He was posted away as well, and just some older snaps of them. These are some snaps when they come back to visit Thelma's family back in Belfast. And this is Herbert. Thelma died before Herbert. They stayed together. They had a very happy marriage, and Herbert lived well into his 90s. As well, so it was really lovely to be able to see those pictures and to be able to find out about what happened, about the end of a story, and the fact that there was this very happy ending as well. Because while Herbert and the minister had felt that sort of their permission from the decision from the church was fine for them to get married, the American military authorities very quickly decided that permission was going to be needed to get married, and they began to warn troops against marrying local women. And in Northern Ireland, newspapers repeated the warnings, and they suggested that the reason for this advice was the concern for potential brides. They very much said that, worry for women who were going to get married because they wouldn't be given allowances from the US authorities, and they would have no guarantee of maintenance in the future. But it's very clear that the warnings had limited impact. And in July 1942, there was a circular issued by the US military that said that marriages could only take place with the US commanding officer's permission. And after written notice of 3 months. So again, to try and prevent these very quick marriages as well. And they were discouraged for a number of reasons. It was felt that it would be bad for morale if some soldiers had wives with them while others didn't. And very much that it was sort of believed that it would complicate Anglo-American relations, and this sort of idea that Americans were grabbing off British girls while, British soldiers were overseas. And also it was sort of described as that marriages were a passing fad with post-war complications. Also the fact that US marriage allowances were much higher than those of the British Army. And this believed it was described as constitutes a certain lure for the worst kind of girl. And a cable from a concerned American mother to the commandant of the Derry Naval Base expressed similar concerns, and it said, her son plans to marry an Irish girl. I do not approve. Please stop marriage plans. Boy is heir to considerable estate. Possibly girl knows this. And for those, though, who decided to marry despite these warnings or despite opposition from families, gaining permission was a complicated process. It was designed to weed out those whose motives may have been questionable, who may only have been interested in money. And including written permission, you needed a medical examination. If it was suspected that the woman was pregnant, that did sometimes lead to the process being expedited. So there was one request for marriage to the commandant of the naval base in Derry, and it stated, "I respectfully request permission to marry immediately because of the physical condition of my prospective bride. This request is made in an effort to relieve the nervousness which a long delay would cause and to save my prospective bride as much embarrassment as possible." And a considerable number of women were already pregnant when they submitted the permissions, request for permissions to marry. And it was quite clear that this stigma that was attached to being pregnant outside of marriage cut across a class divide as well. So there was a letter written from a woman in Derry to Colonel Ladd at the naval base, and it said that she wrote and she said that she was getting married. It wasn't for personal gain, or it wasn't to try and get to America. She went on to explain that through a slight mistake, I've become pregnant. And she said her condition was of great concern because my family have a very high reputation, owing to my father holding a government position. I do not wish any scandal to be fallen on them. And it is also significant as well that it was only the women who were vetted and interviewed and whose suitability was questioned. Men weren't put under the same scrutiny. They simply had to declare that they had no dependents in the United States and could support a wife. And not all of those women who did end up, who became pregnant, did end up getting married either. And the records of the Mater Dei Mother and Baby Home in Belfast record several, a number of occasions where women were admitted and who name American soldiers as the father of their children, who for a variety of reasons were not going to marry them, often because they had vanished, they had disappeared, they seemed to have been posted elsewhere and they couldn't contact them. And the American forces also relied on local information concerning women who wished to marry US servicemen and were making their decisions to marry. In Belfast, the American Red Cross seconded a local woman to assist the commanding officer in vetting those who applied for marriage. And she interviewed local girls and decided if they were suitable. And this is a woman that I interviewed about 20 years ago now. And she was very interesting. She said that she often saw the same woman coming in again and again. And because she knew who they were, she had that inside knowledge. But it was very clear, that there were a lot of, particularly a lot of class issues going on about who was suitable and who wasn't suitable and the type of girls that were suitable. And she was very clear about the type of women that were unsuitable as well. Letters of reference were often provided from priests or from ministers. And requests were often sent as well to the naval base, from naval bases and from army bases to the police county inspector's office, and they asked if the person was of a good character and loyal. Now the county inspector of the RUC in Derry wrote concerning one woman that it is common knowledge that this person and her sister are regarded as of low moral character by the majority of citizens of this city. And of course the issue of loyalty took on this greater concern in Northern Ireland, and it was about this fear of anyone who may have had connections with the IRA, who would be engaged in kind of any sort of anti-war activity as well. So just to conclude then, as we've talked about, World War II did bring on increased concerns about morality, about behaviour, and particularly about the behaviour of young working class women. Their presence, their visibility on the streets, often in the company of US troops, exacerbated this concern, and there were variety of efforts about trying to control and regulate their behaviour. There was increased vigilance by the police on the streets, and that is reflected in the increase of prosecutions for offences relating to sex work and to indecent behaviour. And undoubtedly, though, there was some relaxation in standards of sexual morality and behaviour in the war years, and there was a lot of concern about this that does contribute to these increase in prosecutions. And of course, the arrival of US troops did add an extra dimension to these concerns, and very much the health and well-being of troops was often prioritised above local women, and preserving good relations was put on a priority, about, you know, and about sort of punishing those who might have posed a record, might have posed a risk to the troops. And of course, it was, you know, it was again, as we said, women who were seen as the danger and whose behaviour was controlled more. And women were, of course, more vulnerable to this loss of respectability as well from their behaviour too. But of course, in many cases, relationships with US troops were cordial and convivial and friendly. I think these are brilliant images of a kind of sports day at a US base. And you know, we don't know exactly how many women married US troops. It's around 1800, around 2000. We don't know how many marriages were successful. We know that some couples stayed in Northern Ireland. Some went back to America following a campaign by the Belfast Telegraph in 1947 that complained that Northern Irish girls and women were being forgotten about and neglected. About around 800 women who were brides travelled to the States. We don't know how many of those marriages were successful. We don't know if many got there and found that what they had hoped for was not necessarily the reality. But we do know that there are marriages like Bert and Thelma that were long and happy and successful. And we know that there were other women who were left with babies. There was a legacy left by the troops when they left. So I suppose what we're seeing are these complex relationships with both happy and sad endings. So thank you.
So thank you very much, Leanne. That was great to hear. It was incredibly comprehensive. I'm sure everyone would agree, particularly for what is often quite a sanitized topic of the Second World War, particularly some of the more personal side of things, or certainly when you talk about the venereal disease and things like that. It's not often widely publicized like that. It's all overly romanticized, probably a better way to look at it, especially through modern eyes. But we've had a few questions already. Some people sharing stories on the chat on Zoom as well. But there's a question on Facebook. I think you've probably quite comprehensively already answered it as well in your talk. But Carrie asks, were local women warned against US soldiers?
Yeah, you know, there was sort of, I suppose, the more official warnings in terms of marriages and not going down that route. But again, there were the sort of more general concerns, and concerns often from, whether it's from religious authorities as well, about from the pulpit, about the kind of fraternizing. And again, it depending on your sort of political standpoint as well, about that kind of fraternizing with the troops too. But there are those more general, and we see it in the First World War as well, about those kind of, the idea that where they talk there about sort of khaki fever, the idea that girls were often swept away by men in uniform, and those concerns, you see those sort of similar concerns again in World War II about those sort of interactions. And there's a kind of split thing about girls both being, you know, vulnerable to this men's attention, but also being a danger to men as well, and danger to the troops.
Well, that's what I was going to ask as well. Is you say it's like two sides of the same coin, where it's the men are almost totally blameless in this, and it's all the focus is on the women, where at one point they are susceptible to the men, but at the same time, on the other side of that coin, they are the ones who are the bad influence. And there's this whole narrative of their sort of their moralities being questioned, and even the language you were using, we were talking about scandalous. I think you used the word disgrace at one point, and dirty as well a couple of times. Would you say that's was like sort of like as examples, or sort of typifies a sort of like systematic sort of view or the opinion of, I guess, the US forces and their command structure, or maybe the Northern Irish judicial system? Or would you go as far as to say that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a sort of that language, I suppose, about women and about particularly women who was believed were involved in sex work, or whose sort of morals were being questioned.
Yeah.
You see that right from nearly a kind of a Victorian period of language and of discussion, and about the attempts to, right from when we think about establishment of Magdalen laundries and things, that idea about trying to reform women and women needing reform. There were no institutions for men to be reformed. So that, in a sense, that double standard has a very long history, and in periods of war you see it becoming more exacerbated whenever there are fears, and particularly fears around troops and around the things like the sexual health of troops. So you have the Contagious Diseases Act, so even from the 19th century, which were about forcibly examining women seen in areas where around troop bases as well. And there was that same legislation that appears in the First World War, and then similar legislation in the Second World War as well. So those concerns are there, and then are exacerbated by war. And all of those individuals and groups, who are all really male as well, are all kind of, that's where the focus is, and the blame is often on women.
There's a question from Jim in the chat. He's asking if there was a large uptick in orphans or adoptees or single mothers after the war. I assume that's he's referring to.
You do see a bit of a spike in terms of both rates of what was termed illegitimacy, and also in some of the numbers. There are, in terms of mother and baby homes, there are only sort of a few that were open at times, and the ones that people are familiar with hadn't opened then. But there is a sort of an increase, and that's something that you see in sort of across most of the UK and in this particular time as well. And definitely associated, I think that the link is often associated with those sort of troops there as well, and also so there is a sort of, we don't know, for this period we don't know a lot of the very definite figures about official adoption isn't until sort of legislation changes in 1950 and things change on. So for this period we're not completely sure, but in terms of the rates of illegitimacy, they do increase during the Second World War.
I think, Brian, do you want to come in and ask a question?
Well, I was just wondering, in terms of sort of the authorities' attempts to try and control sexual behaviour and the interaction between girls and troops. I mean, what was the role of was there a role for women members of the RUC? And didn't the sort of Ministry of Home Affairs here try and organise sort of unionist women to patrol streets and, sort of regulate these girls?
Yes, and funny, that was a paragraph I'd taken out that earlier on. But yes, there was again, come from a lot of concern that there should be that the idea of having patrols, and the first women patrols again emerged during the First World War, and from those in Belfast there are sort of two women who are not, who kind of are police, are attached to the police. They're police women, but they very much have a role which is about looking after women who've been arrested, but also this preventative role, and that they again, the Home Affairs, and actually coming from within education as well, there's a big push that says we need to have these women patrols back on the street, and their sort of aim was this preventative, that you went around and tried to identify, if you saw maybe girls talking to troops, you would sort of try and intervene and just push them in different directions and try and break up those sort of those sort of incidents. And again, the idea of offering more wholesome entertainments and things that people weren't involved in kind of being out in the streets at night. but this was again a push, and then the push was about formalizing this in terms of RUC officers, and I think there are 6 eventually women who are employed as within the police from this, and again it is coming from that very much that concern that there was a need for women, and seeing this as a women approaching other women as well, and this role of that women should be involved in trying to sort of look after those women who are engaged in sex work and things as well.
Thanks, guys.
Well, that's a great question, Brian, and that's not something I've ever actually heard before. So that's actually quite fascinating. Actually, I've never really. But again, it's the onus is very much on policing the women. It wasn't on policing the soldiers.
Yeah, and the discussion of the women patrols in the First World War as well is really interesting about very much the language, and they're very much about trying to encourage them into some of the rescue homes and things like this as well, which of course these girls weren't really interested in going into at all, but it's very and in Dublin they tried to have a sort of like if there were women going out in a pair, they tried to have a Protestant and a Catholic woman going out in a pair and things as well. They don't seem to have been tried quite as hard to do that in Belfast, but there was a woman called Jane Fallon who was a Catholic woman who went on to be with there was both a Protestant woman and a Catholic woman who went to become those first police women as well.
So if anybody else has any questions, do please just either put them in the chat box or just use the raise your hand function, and I can come to you if you want to ask them in person. Judy's just shared a story about her mother, who was an older teenager, talking about her experience of the black GIs, and often but obviously you talked about that racial element, and you've talked about a class element as well, but there wasn't very much like again very uniquely Northern Irish, I guess, that sectarian element or that religious element, because there was a lot of cross community marriages as well. I've seen examples of that, and it wasn't there was again Protestant marriages, and there was Catholic marriages as well. There wasn't really affected by that sort of Northern Irish problem. Sure, there wasn't.
No, there doesn't seem to as well, and that story that Judy shared was interesting too, because whenever I'd interviewed and talked to people, sometimes that they were very they were very aware of how those experiences and the feelings that they'd had at the time, that they were very acutely describing how that for them they had never, this was so different, they had never seen anybody of a different race before, and that they the kind of the shock factor around this as well, that there was sort of those elements in that too. But yes, there does seem to have been that sort of while I think a lot of the concern from the authorities about the sort of Irish troops and that anti-British feeling and all these sort of things, the reality, I think, is, as you say, whenever it came to those marriages and relationships, those that didn't seem to play as much of a factor for those couples anyway, whether families may have had other ideas and other feelings, but for many couples that wasn't a problem as well.
I don't think there's any more questions. Certainly don't see them. But just to go back very quickly, just because I'm aware it's all me talking here as well. But you mentioned the Herbert Cook and Thelma Smith marriage, and how sort of lauded it was as the first marriage, and her father being locked out of the church and so on. But there's examples, I think, of the US technicians that you briefly mentioned at the beginning, of them falling in love as well. I think there's one previous marriage between a US technician and a local woman. But do you think that was because they weren't technically uniformed US forces, that was the reason why that wasn't celebrated as such, or didn't make the press in the same way?
Yeah, I think that's probably the kind of the issue behind that, and that this the Thelma Smith and the Herbert Cook case did kind of generate so much interest in the fact that sort of I think he was supposed to have been AWOL really, and whether and that kind of, was he going to be punished for this as well, and those sort of things too. I think so there was a whole sort of added element to that, and that's the kind of I think that was what their story was really was really interesting about that, and I think it did captivate, and probably, you know, that they were that sort of that, oh, they just met so quickly in a cafe, and look, it was, they were, you know, that they made the kind of, you know, that sort of poster couple as well, I think, too.
Yeah, of course. There's another question that just came through on Facebook from Mark, who says, obviously this talk focused on the relationship with the American soldiers. He's wondering if there's any anecdotal stories about interactions with Canadian servicemen and Northern Irish women, and were they any better or any worse than the Americans?
Similar as well, and particularly in those areas, I think, where you had Canadian troops as well. Sometimes, often, a lot of the examples, when you see sort of newspaper reports in Derry and in that example in Portrush as well, often it's Canadian and American troops. So you'll often kind of get them sort of thrown in and often merged together as well. So they're, I think sometimes that differentiation wasn't necessarily always made too, but they appear quite regularly in those as well.
Something I've seen is there's a lot of instances of local women marrying Canadian personnel. I think it's worth pointing out that as much as the American relationship is lauded in Northern Ireland, there was actually more Canadians. The Royal Canadian Navy had a larger presence in Derry, I believe. I'm sure somebody will correct me if I'm mistaken, than the US Navy did, but it doesn't seem to have the same sort of traction.
No. And I think often they've been just sort of put to, they're not that sort of differentiation isn't often made. That was interesting. I didn't know that.
It's a great question from Mark. It's a point worth bringing up. Matt McGee on Facebook, again, this is nothing I know anything about. He sort of flipped the question around. He wants to know if there was any local men that married American service women. Was there any examples of that? Or do you know of? Or
I don't. It is a very good question. Yeah. And I'm sure there probably were. So I don't know if anybody else may know the answer to that one. I'm sure there were.
There you go, Matt. You've got us both stumped.
Simon might know. Oh, there's Simon. Hi, Simon.
No, it's to ask a question. Leanne, did you come across any mixed race kids in the mother and baby homes?
I don't think so. And I'm sort of hesitating because I'm not, sometimes there wasn't always reference to very much detail about babies. There are some references to mixed race children, but they're after the Second World War, and some of those may well have been troops, still US troops, but the references that there were to US troops were a number of them from the Mater Dei. The relationships weren't necessarily consensual. That seemed to be to be a big factor as to why they were in the home. But I haven't come across, largely because only the Mater Dei home and the records aren't great for the other homes in that period. The other homes open slightly after this, so you get sort of better records kind of following that. I don't know whether have you come across many?
Not many. There was a documentary, it must have been nearly 30 years ago, which was about the children of Black GIs in Northern Ireland, but I just haven't been able to find it. It was either on the TV or BBC, and it just seems to have disappeared. But it did talk about them, I think, particularly in sort of places like Tyrone, around there. There were definitely a few. The consulate recorded the race of Americans who married local girls, and they found, I think, 3 Black GIs who married local girls. Okay. Which obviously was really complicated because interracial marriage was illegal in a lot of states.
Well, that's interesting. I'm now second guessing myself, and I'm going to go back and I'll have another look. I'll let you know if those. But I don't think it was mentioned in in those sort of examples there.
Yeah, thank you.
No, great question, Simon. So I just my time here, I've certainly heard anecdotal stories of mixed race children, left behind and such as well, who maybe didn't even know who their fathers were. That doesn't even apply to mixed race; it just applies to any lot of children sort of left behind, or single mothers, as somebody asked earlier. But again, it's only anecdotal. I've never really seen documentary evidence of it. I'm very conscious of the time, and people have taken people's evenings, and certainly I need to go home and get my dinner as well, and I'm sure Leanne and stuff as well. But Leanne, do you just want to give what you said to start, like your podcast and stuff, one last plug and things, just in case I missed it?
Yes, if you want to listen to the Bad Bridget podcast, you don't even have to listen. You could just give us 5 stars. That would be brilliant. But yes, if you might find that interesting as well. So yeah.
Brilliant. Well, so one last comment there. Claire just came in talking about mixed race and obviously how that's largely focused on Black Americans, but she's actually talked about her cousin's father was a Native American. It's certainly not something I ever came across.
No, that's really interesting as well. Yeah,
sort of easily forgotten as well, definitely. Very good point. I just want to, Simon, sorry, just popped up again.
Yeah, just sometimes Native Americans joined Black regiments.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes African Americans pretended to be Native Americans because they thought that gave them an even bigger edge with the girls. But Native Americans could serve in sort of white units. Some Black soldiers pretended to be Native Americans.
There we go. That's certainly talking about that race issue, and that's certainly even it's fascinating. That's nothing I've really considered before. But I just want to, I think we'll stop it there before we probably sit and talk about this all evening. But I just want to thank you all again for joining us tonight. And just our next couple of talks are going to deviate away from our US 80 commemorations and move away from the American theme, and we'll focus on the Belfast Blitz. So next month we have historian Laz Fallon is going to be giving a talk called Hands Across the Border, Assistance from Southern Fire Brigades in the Belfast Blitz. And then in May, I will be delivering a talk on this, looking at the stories behind the names of the victims of the Belfast Blitz. So hope you can all join us then. And thanks once again for all your participation tonight. And what was a great discussion and question and answer session as well. And thanks once again to Leanne for her time and her talk.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, everybody.